Tonight, we revisit one case that became part of British memory. One life, one investigation, one record that has never been closed. The case of Mary Jane Kelly begins in Spitalfields, London, in the autumn of 1888. Spitalfields at that time was a district of the East End of London, situated immediately to the north and east of the boundary of the City of London, within the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Police's H Division. Its population numbered in the tens of thousands and was composed largely of casual labourers, street sellers, factory hands, and the permanent residents of common lodging houses that occupied virtually every street and turning in the neighbourhood. The district had been a centre of the silk weaving trade since the 17th century, but by the 1880s that trade had collapsed, and the physical fabric of the neighbourhood reflected decades of an economic decline. The streets were narrow and densely settled. The houses, many of them dating from the 18th century, had been subdivided into lodgings and let at the lowest rents the market would bear. Among those streets, Dorset Street stood at a particular extreme. Contemporary observers, journalists and social investigators regularly identified it as the most dangerous street in London. It was occupied almost entirely by common lodging houses, the majority controlled by a small number of slum landlords, and it served as a place of last resort for those who could not maintain lodging elsewhere in the city. It was through a covered passage off Dorset Street, no more than a few feet wide, that the events of November 1888 concluded. What little is known of Mary Jane Kelly's early life comes principally from a single source: the testimony of Joseph Barnett, her companion, given at the coroner's inquest held at Shoreditch Town Hall on the 12th of November 1888. Barnett was reporting what Kelly had told him during the course of their time together. No birth record, baptismal certificate, or corroborating documentary evidence has been identified in the years since the inquest to verify the details he provided. The record is, therefore, a record of a story Kelly chose to tell the man with whom she lived, and not a record of independently confirmed fact. According to Barnett's testimony, Kelly was born in Limerick, Ireland, around the year 1863. Whether she meant the city of Limerick or the county of that name was not made clear in the surviving record, and Barnett did not specify. Her father's name was John Kelly. He worked in an ironworks. When Mary Jane was still a young child, the family moved from Limerick to Wales, where her father had found employment. Barnett recalled the county as either Caernarfonshire or Carmarthenshire. He was uncertain, and the inquest transcript reflects that uncertainty without resolving it. The family was large. Barnett testified that Kelly had described 6 or 7 brothers and at least one sister. One of those brothers, named Henry, was said to have served in the 2nd Battalion of the Scots Guards. No documentary record of any sibling has been located. At approximately 16 years of age, Kelly married a coal miner whose surname was Davies. His given name does not appear in any surviving account of Barnett's testimony or in the inquest record. By the calculation that places Kelly's birth around 1863, the marriage would have occurred around 1879. It was brief. Davies was killed, according to Kelly's account, as related by Barnett, in a colliery explosion. The precise colliery and the date of the explosion have not been identified in contemporary records. The documentary evidence for the marriage and for Davies's death is absent from the surviving archive. What the record preserves is Barnett's account of what Kelly told him, that she had been married and had been widowed at a young age. Following the death of her husband, Kelly left Wales for Cardiff. The duration of her time in Cardiff is not established with precision. Her neighbours in Miller's Court and the witnesses who knew her in the months before her death described Kelly consistently in similar terms. She was regarded as attractive and good-humoured. She was known to sing. She reportedly spoke Welsh, which she had retained from the years her family spent in the Welsh counties. Joseph Barnett, by every account given at the inquest and in the subsequent press coverage, was devoted to her and remained so through the events of the autumn of 1888 and beyond. The record of Kelly's movements from Cardiff to London is partial and derived from later witness testimony rather than from primary documents. By around 1884, she had arrived in London. Her initial lodgings were in Crispin Street, Spitalfields. She worked for a period for a tobacconist in Chelsea, which placed her briefly in a different part of the city from the East End, where she would eventually settle. Through an acquaintance she had made, described in the accounts as a French woman she had encountered in the Knightsbridge area, Kelly found work in a high-class establishment in the West End, in the district of Fitzrovia. She remained in that position for approximately a year or less. The accounts suggest she was well paid during this period and spent on clothing and on the ordinary expenses of that manner of life. By approximately 1885 or 1886, she had returned to the East End. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now back to the record. Back in the East End, Kelly lived for a time near the commercial gasworks in Stepney, in the company of a man named Morganstone. That arrangement did not persist, and she subsequently formed a connection with a mason's plasterer named Joseph Fleming, with whom she resided for a further period. By 1886, or the early months of 1887, she was residing at Cooley's lodging house on Thrall Street, Spitalfields, which placed her within immediate reach of Dorset Street and the neighbourhood where the events of 1888 would occur. On the 8th of April 1887, which fell on Good Friday of that year, Kelly encountered Joseph Barnett on Commercial Street. Barnett was 28 years old at that time and worked as a fish porter at Billingsgate Market. He took her for a drink. They met again the following day and agreed to live together. The arrangement that followed was stable by the ordinary standards of the common lodging house world. They moved through a succession of addresses in George Street, Little Paternoster Row and Brick Lane before settling. By March of 1888, at room 13, Miller's Court, off Dorset Street, Spitalfields. The room at Miller's Court was reached by passing through a covered passage that ran between the premises numbered 26 and 27 on Dorset Street. The passage was narrow. The court itself was a small enclosed yard containing approximately 6 rooms, each let at low rents by John McCarthy, who kept a chandler's shop at number 27 Dorset Street and was the proprietor of Miller's Court. Room 13 was situated at the rear of the passage. The room measured approximately 12 feet by 10 feet and was furnished with a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace grate. A window to the left of the door contained a broken pane, which had been patched with rags and pieces of old clothing. Kelly's weekly rent was 4 shillings and sixpence. By the late autumn of 1888, the rent had fallen considerably into arrears. The amount outstanding at the time of her death was approximately 29 shillings, representing several weeks of accumulated debt. While Barnett had been employed as a fish porter, the household had maintained itself through his wages. After Barnett's departure from the room on the 30th of October, 1888, Kelly was left without that income and appears to have returned to street work to meet her expenses, including the ongoing rent. The circumstances of Barnett's departure require some account. Over the course of the autumn, Kelly had begun to allow other women in circumstances similar to her own, to share the room when they had no other place to sleep. The practice caused friction between her and Barnett. A woman named Maria Harvey had been staying in the room with some regularity and was present at the time of the final quarrel. Barnett objected to this arrangement. On the evening of the 30th of October 1888, following a dispute over the matter, Barnett left Miller's Court. He did not sever his connection with Kelly entirely. He continued to visit her in the days that followed, and by his own testimony at the inquest, their relations remained cordial. He last saw her alive at approximately 7:45 in the evening of the 8th of November, 1888. Maria Harvey was also present during that visit. She departed before Barnett left. The autumn of 1888 had proceeded under the shadow of a series of murders that had begun in August of that year. 4 women had been killed in the Whitechapel and Spitalfields districts between the 31st of August and the 30th of September. The victims were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes. Each had worked as a prostitute in the East End. Each had been killed in the street or in a yard in the open air. The Metropolitan Police had been investigating the killings since August under the direction of Inspector Frederick Aberline, who led the day-to-day inquiry for H Division, with the broader oversight of the Criminal Investigation Department under its head, Robert Anderson. Sir Charles Warren served as Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police throughout the period. The investigation had proceeded through extensive witness interviews, systematic canvassing of the neighbourhood, and the examination of multiple named individuals without producing an arrest or a viable identified suspect. The press coverage of the killings had been extensive and unrelenting. The Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Star, and the Illustrated Police News, among many other publications, had devoted substantial column space to the murders throughout September and October. The East End was in a state of heightened anxiety. Women working the streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields were aware of the danger and aware of the coverage. Kelly would have been no exception. By the evening of Thursday, the 8th of November, 1888, the night was cold. The streets of Spitalfields were populated, as they were at all hours, with the residents of the common lodging houses, street sellers, dock workers, and others moving through the gaslit thoroughfares. The passage to Miller's Court was dark beyond the lamp at the street entrance. The interior of room 13 would have been lit, if at all, by firelight or by candle. At approximately 11:45 on the night of the 8th of November, a neighbour named Mary Ann Cox was returning to her own room in Miller's Court after having been out. Cox occupied a room at the front of the court. As she entered the passage from Dorset Street, she encountered Kelly walking ahead of her in the company of a man. Cox described the man as short and stout, with a blotchy face and a full carroty moustache, wearing a longish coat and carrying a pail of beer. Kelly, by Cox's account, was very drunk. As they reached Kelly's door, Kelly said goodnight to Cox. Cox heard her say that she was going to have a song. Cox continued to her own room. Within a few minutes of entering it, she heard Kelly begin to sing from behind the wall of room 13. The song was A Violet from Mother's Grave, a music hall ballad written by Will H. Fox and published in 1881. It is a sentimental song, set in the voice of a child tending a mother's grave. Kelly sang it repeatedly. Mary Ann Cox went out again at approximately midnight. Kelly was still singing. Cox returned at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning. By that time, the singing had stopped. There was no light visible under Kelly's door. Elizabeth Prater, who occupied a room directly above room 13 in Miller's Court, returned to her room at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning and retired to sleep. She reported hearing nothing from below until sometime between 3:30 and 4 o'clock in the morning, when she heard a single cry of the word murder. The cry was brief. It did not repeat. Prater did not rise or raise an alarm. A witness named Sarah Lewis, who had been sitting up in another room in the court that night, similarly reported hearing a single cry of murder at around that hour. In the East End of 1888, a cry of that kind in the early morning hours was not uncommon, and neither woman investigated. The time at which that cry was uttered has been the subject of sustained discussion in the investigation's subsequent history, as it bears on the question of when Kelly died. The medical examination of the body, conducted later that morning by Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the Divisional Police Surgeon for H Division, and subsequently by Dr. Thomas Bond, a consultant surgeon engaged independently by the police, estimated the time of death at between approximately 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the morning, based on the condition of the remains. Dr. Bond placed his estimate at the lower end of that range. Dr. Phillips gave a figure somewhat later. The testimony of Prater and Lewis, placing a cry at approximately 3:30 to 4 o'clock, has not been definitively reconciled with the medical estimates. The question of time of death in this case was entered into the record as estimated rather than established, and no subsequent examination has resolved it to a point of certainty. One further account deserves note in connection with the hours of that night. A labourer named George Hutchinson, who was acquainted with Kelly and had known her for some years, came forward at Commercial Street Police Station on the 12th of November, 3 days after the discovery of the body. Hutchinson stated that he had encountered Kelly on Commercial Street at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning of the 9th of November, and that he had observed her enter Miller's Court in the company of a man he described in considerable detail. He described the man as approximately 34 to 35 years of age, 5 feet 6 inches in height, of dark complexion, with a dark moustache curled at the ends, wearing a long dark coat, a dark felt hat, and carrying a small parcel. Hutchinson stated that he had stood outside the entrance to Miller's Court for approximately 45 minutes without seeing either Kelly or the man emerge. Inspector Aberline, who reviewed Hutchinson's statement at the time, considered it credible and directed that the description be circulated. The description was published in the press and in police notices. Subsequent researchers have questioned both the reliability of the account and the conditions under which such detailed observation could have been made, given the hour and the available light. Hutchinson's statement was entered into the record. Its reliability was not established. At approximately 11:15 on the morning of the 9th of November, 1888, John McCarthy, the landlord of Miller's Court, directed his assistant, Thomas Bowyer, to call at room 13 and collect the rent that had been accumulating in arrears. Bowyer went to the door of room 13 and knocked. He received no answer. He knocked again. Again, there was no response. Bowyer noticed that the window to the left of the door was broken and that the coat or rag that had served as a curtain over the broken pane was displaced or movable. He reached through the broken pane and pulled aside the covering. He looked into the room. Bowyer immediately went to McCarthy's shop at 27 Dorset Street and told McCarthy what he had seen through the window. McCarthy accompanied Bowyer back to Miller's Court, looked through the broken pane himself, and immediately dispatched Bowyer to Commercial Street Police Station to report the discovery. Bowyer reached the station at approximately 10 minutes to 11, or a few minutes before. He reported what he had seen to the officer on duty. Inspector Walter Beck accompanied Bowyer back to Miller's Court and confirmed the situation. Beck at once sent for Dr. George Bagster Phillips and notified senior officers. The news spread rapidly through Commercial Street Police Station and through the network of the Metropolitan Police's H Division. Inspector Frederick Aberline, who had been leading the day-to-day inquiry into the earlier Whitechapel murders since August, was notified and made his way to Miller's Court. Other senior officers attended as the morning progressed. The scene at the court was secured. A crowd gathered on Dorset Street outside the passage entrance, as word of the discovery spread through the neighbourhood. The door to room 13 remained locked. The police were in possession of a key, but a decision was taken to defer entry pending the arrival of bloodhounds that Commissioner Sir Charles Warren had arranged to keep on standby in connection with the Whitechapel murders investigation. The hounds did not arrive. One account states that they had already been returned to their owner. The door was ultimately forced open at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, more than 2.5 hours after Bowyer had first reported the discovery to the police station. The delay attracted criticism in the press in the days that followed. The investigation was formally opened on the 9th of November, 1888, under the direction of Inspector Frederick Aberline, acting for H Division of the Metropolitan Police, with the broader oversight of the Criminal Investigation Department and the Metropolitan Police Command. Officers were stationed at the entrance to Miller's Court to control access. The neighbourhood was canvassed. Statements were taken from those present in the court and on the surrounding streets. Joseph Barnett was located and informed of the discovery. He was brought to Miller's Court and asked to make an identification. Barnett identified Kelly by her ears and her eyes, which were the only features that permitted identification in the condition in which the body was found. He confirmed that the woman was Mary Jane Kelly, his companion of the preceding year and a half. John McCarthy, the landlord, also confirmed the identification. The formal identification was entered into the investigative record. The evidence within the room was examined and recorded by the attending officers. The grate in the fireplace had contained a fire that had burned to very great heat during the course of the night, A tin kettle found in the room had been sufficiently close to the fire that its spout had melted. The fire had consumed clothing. The significance of that fire was subsequently discussed among investigators, and in the years that followed, among those examining the case. One interpretation held that the fire had been deliberately stoked to a high temperature in order to provide light for activities conducted in the room by whoever was present. Another interpretation proposed that clothing or other items had been burned in the fire in order to destroy evidence. No definitive conclusion was reached. Kelly's own clothes were found folded on a chair in the room. The room was otherwise in the condition of ordinary occupation. Witnesses were interviewed in the days that followed. Mary Ann Cox was interviewed regarding her account of seeing Kelly return to the court in the early hours and hearing her sing. Elizabeth Prater was interviewed regarding the cry she had heard between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. Sarah Lewis provided a statement to the same effect. Julia Van Turney, a neighbour who occupied room 1 in Miller's Court, was interviewed regarding Kelly's habits and her knowledge of Kelly's relationship with Barnett. Various residents of Dorset Street and the surrounding streets were canvassed and their accounts recorded. The investigation generated a substantial volume of statement material in the days immediately following the discovery. On the 12th of November, as noted above, George Hutchinson presented himself at Commercial Street Police Station and gave his detailed account of the man he had seen with Kelly in the early hours of the 9th. Inspector Aberline interviewed Hutchinson and examined his statement at length before determining that it merited credibility and directing its circulation. The description Hutchinson provided was printed in the newspapers and posted in notices through the relevant districts. No individual was identified as a result. No arrest followed from Hutchinson's account. The broader investigation into the Whitechapel murders had by this point interviewed in excess of 2,000 individuals and had generated an extensive body of documentation held in the Metropolitan Police files. Multiple named suspects had been examined in connection with the earlier murders. None had been charged. The investigation continued after the 9th of November without producing an arrest in connection with Kelly's death or with the preceding 4 murders. Commissioner Sir Charles Warren submitted his resignation on the 10th of November, the day after the discovery of Kelly's body, though that resignation had been submitted in advance of the murder in connection with an unrelated dispute with the Home Office. Its effective date fell the following day, and the timing was noted in the press. A post-mortem examination was conducted at the Shoreditch mortuary, to which Kelly's body had been removed from Miller's Court. The primary examining physician was Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the divisional police surgeon for H Division, who had attended the scene that morning and conducted the initial examination within the room. Dr. Thomas Bond, a consultant surgeon who had been engaged in connection with the broader Whitechapel murders inquiry, was also present and conducted an independent examination, producing a separate written report. Both reports were entered into the Metropolitan Police files, designated MEPO 33153, held at what is now the National Archives at Kew. The cause of death was determined by both examining physicians to be the severance of the right carotid artery. This finding was entered into the official record and was not disputed at the subsequent inquest. Dr. Phillips's examination of the body within the room had noted that the body lay 2/3 over toward the edge of the bed nearest the door, and that the distribution of blood indicated the body had been moved after death. Both physicians confirmed their findings at the inquest. The post-mortem examination, conducted by the 2 physicians, occupied approximately 2.5 hours, a duration that was entered into the record. The nature and extent of the injuries to the body were documented in the medical reports. Those reports have been published in subsequent historical and forensic works. The script does not reproduce their contents. Dr. Thomas Bond's contribution to the investigation extended beyond the post-mortem examination itself. Bond produced a written report containing not only his medical findings, but also a separate section in which he offered an assessment of the probable character and habits of the person responsible for the Whitechapel murders. In that assessment, Bond speculated that the killer was a man of quiet and inoffensive appearance, of middle age, accustomed to wearing a cloak or overcoat, solitary in his habits, and possibly subject to periodic attacks of acute mania. Bond suggested the man would be in employment or of sufficient means to avoid attracting suspicion in ordinary circumstances, and would not present to those around him as a person of dangerous character. This assessment was produced in written form and submitted to the Metropolitan Police. It was entered into the investigative record and was not circulated publicly at the time. It has since been cited by historians of forensic science as an early instance of what would later be formalised as criminal profiling, the systematic written assessment of a perpetrator's probable characteristics based on the physical evidence of a crime. Bond's report was one of the first such assessments produced in connection with a British criminal investigation, and its existence was not widely known until the Metropolitan Police files were made accessible to researchers in the 20th century. The medical evidence was entered into the record as it stood. The cause of death was established. The time of death remained a matter of estimation rather than certainty. The post-mortem examination had been completed, and the findings of the two examining physicians were available to the coroner's proceedings that followed. The investigation had accumulated a substantial body of statement evidence from witnesses in and around Miller's Court and the surrounding streets of Spitalfields. No suspect had been identified and no arrest had been made. An inquest into the death of Mary Jane Kelly was convened at Shoreditch Town Hall on the 12th of November, 1888, 3 days after the discovery of the body. The presiding officer was Dr. Roderick MacDonald, who served as coroner for North East Middlesex. The inquest would ordinarily have been conducted by Wyn Edwin Baxter, who had presided over the inquests into the deaths of the 4 earlier canonical Whitechapel victims. Kelly's body had been taken to the mortuary at Shoreditch rather than to a mortuary within the Whitechapel district, and this placement fell within MacDonald's jurisdictional boundary rather than Baxter's. Some commentators at the time, and in the subsequent historical literature, suggested that this jurisdictional arrangement had been the result of a deliberate decision by the police or by the Home Office. That suggestion has not been verified in the documentary record. The proceedings were held and concluded in a single day, which attracted criticism in the press that followed. The Times, in its coverage of the inquest, suggested that the proceedings had been conducted with undue speed and that the evidence before the jury had not been fully developed. During the proceedings, a juror raised the question of whether additional witnesses ought to be called. Coroner MacDonald intervened at that point and stated directly that it was his responsibility, not the jury's, to determine what evidence was necessary for the jury to reach a verdict. He indicated that sufficient evidence had been heard. The exchange was reported in the press and was noted by those who considered the inquest to have been prematurely curtailed. Testimony was taken under oath from a series of witnesses who had known Kelly or who had direct knowledge of the events of the 8th and 9th of November. Joseph Barnett appeared and gave testimony regarding Kelly's background, the history of their relationship, the circumstances of his departure from Miller's Court on the 30th of October, and his identification of the body. He testified to the details of Kelly's early life as she had described it to him, including her birth in Limerick, her family's removal to Wales, her marriage to Davies, the death of her husband in a pit explosion, and her subsequent movements through Cardiff and London. He described the evening of the 8th of November, his visit to room 13 at approximately 7:45, the presence of Maria Harvey, and the money he had given to Kelly before leaving. He testified that Kelly had seemed in good spirits. Mary Ann Cox appeared and gave testimony regarding her encounter with Kelly and an unidentified man at the entrance to Miller's Court at approximately 11:45 on the night of the 8th of November. She described the man as short and stout, with a blotchy face and a full carroty moustache, wearing a longish coat. She described Kelly as very drunk. She testified to having heard Kelly singing from her room through the night, including when Cox went out at approximately midnight and when she returned at approximately 1 o'clock. She confirmed that by 1 o'clock the singing had stopped and no light was visible. Elizabeth Prater gave testimony regarding the cry of murder she had heard at approximately 3:30 to 4 o'clock in the morning. She confirmed that she had not risen or investigated in response to the cry. Sarah Lewis provided similar testimony, placing the cry at approximately the same hour. Julia Van Turney, the occupant of Room 1 in Miller's Court, testified regarding Kelly's habits and her knowledge of Kelly's life and relationship with Barnett. Van Turney stated that Kelly had, on occasion, been frequently drunk and had at some point broken a window in the room. Thomas Bowyer gave testimony regarding his discovery of the body at approximately 10:45 on the morning of the 9th, his return to McCarthy's shop, and his subsequent report to Commercial Street Police Station. John McCarthy testified regarding Kelly's tenancy, her rent arrears, his own observation through the broken window, and the arrangements that had subsequently been made in connection with the burial. Dr. George Baxter Phillips gave medical evidence regarding the post-mortem findings, including the cause of death and his observations regarding the position of the body. The jury retired to consider its verdict after the evidence had been heard. The deliberation was brief. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown. The verdict was entered in the record of the inquest proceedings held before Coroner MacDonald at Shoreditch Town Hall on the 12th of November 1888. It was the same verdict that had been returned in connection with each of the 4 preceding canonical Whitechapel murders. No further proceedings before the coroner's court followed. The inquest record was closed. The verdict had now been entered. The investigation continued. The inquest had established the cause of death and placed it formally in the official record, and the jury had confirmed that the killing was the act of another person or persons whose identity remained unestablished. The Metropolitan Police were in possession of an extensive body of statement evidence, the accounts of witnesses in Miller's Court and on the surrounding streets, the detailed description provided by George Hutchinson, and the findings of 2 examining physicians. They had no suspect who could be charged with the crime. They had no physical evidence connecting any individual to the room at the time of the killing. The investigation would continue for months without producing an arrest. No arrest was ever made. The question of what had happened to the clothing burned in the grate was never definitively resolved. The question of the time of death remained estimated. The testimony of a Dorset Street resident named Caroline Maxwell introduced a further unresolved element into the record. Maxwell attended the inquest and testified under oath that she had seen Kelly alive and spoken with her in the street at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning of the 9th of November, hours after all medical estimates placed Kelly's death. Maxwell described the encounter in specific terms. She maintained her account consistently. Coroner MacDonald questioned her carefully regarding whether she was certain of the date and the person she had seen. Maxwell maintained that she was. Most investigators who have examined the case in the subsequent period consider Maxwell to have been mistaken in the identification, or in the date, or in some combination of the two, given that her account directly contradicts the findings of both examining physicians. The inquest did not resolve the discrepancy. It remains unresolved in the record. The body of Mary Jane Kelly remained in the Shoreditch mortuary while the inquest was held on the 12th of November. Following the conclusion of the inquest proceedings, the question of Kelly's burial was addressed by Joseph Barnett and by John McCarthy, her landlord. Barnett was insistent that the burial conform to the rites of the Catholic Church. McCarthy, who arranged the practical details of the funeral, respected that instruction. Kelly's faith, or at least her identification with the Catholic tradition into which she had been born in Limerick, was a matter of documented record through Barnett's testimony and through the arrangements made for her burial. The funeral took place on the 19th of November, 1888, 10 days after the discovery of the body. Kelly's remains were transported from the Shoreditch mortuary in a plain elm coffin fitted with metal fittings. The coffin bore a small cross and an inscription that read, "Marie Jeanette Kelly, died 9th of November 1888, aged 25 years. The use of the French form of her name on the coffin plate reflected the name by which she'd sometimes been known, the form she'd adopted at some point and used alongside her more common English name. The origin of that French affectation is not documented in the record. The route of the cortège from Shoreditch to St Patrick's Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone covered approximately 6 miles. Crowds gathered along the route as the coffin passed through the streets of the East End. The degree of public attention given to a woman who had arrived in London alone and had lived in a single rented room in the worst street in London was noted by observers at the time without full explanation being offered. The principal mourners accompanying the coffin included Joseph Barnett and several women who had known Kelly and had given evidence at the inquest. They travelled in 2 mourning carriages. The figures who descended from those carriages at the cemetery were the principal graveside mourners, and the number given in some accounts is approximately 8. At the gates of the chapel at St Patrick's Catholic Cemetery, the coffin was received at the door by Father Columban of the Order of St Francis, accompanied by 2 acolytes and a cross-bearer. The service was conducted according to the rites of the Catholic Church. Joseph Barnett and the women accompanying the coffin knelt at the graveside during the service. The grave was registered in the cemetery record as number 16, row 67, in the northeastern corner of the grounds. A gravestone, if one was ever erected at the site, has not been definitively identified at the registered location. The precise position of the grave within the cemetery cannot now be determined with certainty. The grave registration remains the only locating document in the archive. The investigation into the death of Mary Jane Kelly did not conclude with the inquest. The Metropolitan Police continued to pursue inquiries through the remainder of November and into the early months of 1889. Inspector Aberline directed the continuing inquiry into the Whitechapel murders as a connected series, examining the Kelly case in conjunction with the 4 preceding deaths. Officers from H Division continued to canvass the neighbourhood, to re-interview witnesses and to investigate individuals brought to their attention by members of the public. The volume of correspondence directed to the police in connection with the Whitechapel murders had been substantial since August. It increased again following the discovery of Kelly's body in November. Each item required assessment, and where it contained specific allegations, investigation. The majority produced nothing of investigative value. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, faced questions in Parliament in the days following the discovery of Kelly's body regarding the state of the investigation and the failure of the Metropolitan Police to make any arrest in connection with the series of killings. Matthews had earlier in the year declined to authorise the offer of a government reward for information leading to the identification of the killer. That decision had been controversial at the time of the earlier murders and remained so. The argument in favour of a reward was that it might encourage individuals with relevant information to come forward. The argument against, which the Home Office had accepted, was that such rewards were liable to generate false information and to encourage the fabrication of testimony. Matthews maintained his position. No government reward was offered in connection with any of the 5 canonical Whitechapel murders. The resignation of Commissioner Sir Charles Warren became effective on the 10th of November 1888, the day after the discovery of Kelly's body. Warren had submitted his resignation some days earlier in connection with a separate dispute with the Home Office regarding the authority of the Commissioner in relation to the management of the Criminal Investigation Department. The submission of the resignation predated the Kelly murder, but its effective date fell immediately after the discovery of the body. The press covered the resignation in connection with the murders and the public criticism of the Metropolitan Police's handling of the investigation, though the legal and administrative reasons for the resignation were distinct from those public criticisms. Warren was succeeded as Commissioner by James Monroe. No arrest was ever made in connection with the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. The Whitechapel murders investigation was not formally closed at any single identifiable point. Inquiries continued at a reduced level through 1889 and into the 1890s. The Metropolitan Police files relating to the murders were preserved in their institutional archive. The case was entered into the records as unresolved. The question of the killer's identity was not answered. The conditions in which Mary Jane Kelly lived and died were not incidental to the case, but were rather its foundation. The East End of London in the 1880s presented the most densely populated and economically deprived district within the most populous city in the world. The collapse of the Spitalfield silk weaving industry had removed the principal source of skilled employment from the neighbourhood over the preceding decades, and successive waves of immigration, particularly from Eastern Europe, had brought large numbers of new arrivals into an already overcrowded district. Housing stock was insufficient and deteriorating. Common lodging houses, the doss houses of Dorset Street and Thrall Street and Flower and Dean Street, charged between 4p and 8p per night for a bed in a shared room or dormitory. A woman who could not raise that sum by nightfall was required to find it by other means, or to sleep in the street. The 1880s had seen an increase in journalistic and reformist attention to East End conditions. Andrew Mearn's pamphlet, The Bitter Cry of Outcast London, published in 1883, had brought middle-class attention to the specifics of overcrowding, rent exploitation, and moral degradation in the slum districts of the capital. Charles Booth had begun his systematic poverty survey of London in 1886, producing maps that assigned each street a colour corresponding to its economic character. The streets around Dorset Street and Miller's Court appeared in those maps at the lowest end of the scale. The murders of 1888 accelerated the attention brought to bear on those conditions without, in the short term, materially improving them. Women in Kelly's circumstances occupied a specific position within the economy of the common lodging house world. Without a wage, without family support, and without the protection of a legally recognised marriage, a woman who could not pay the nightly lodging fee had recourse to the street. The workhouse existed as an alternative, administered under the Poor Law, but it was a deeply stigmatised institution associated with loss of personal liberty, the enforced separation of families, and conditions understood to be near penal in their character. For many women in the East End, the street was preferable. Kelly's rent arrears at the time of her death, the 29 shillings owed to John McCarthy, represent not a failure of individual management, but a predictable consequence of having lost, 9 days earlier, the man whose wages from Billingsgate Market had kept the room paid for. The broken window, patched with rags, the 2 chairs, the grate in which the fire burned through the last night of her life. These are the details of a room at the extreme margin of what the lodging house economy provided. The popular press of 1888 had expanded considerably in reach and readership as a consequence of the Education Act of 1870, which had created a mass literate readership within a generation. The Whitechapel murders were the first major series of violent crimes to be covered by that expanded press in real time, with daily reports, illustrated supplements, speculative commentary, and correspondence columns that treated the question of the killer's identity as a matter of public participation. The Illustrated Police News published detailed illustrated coverage of each murder, including sketched representations of the victims and of the locations in which they were found. The coverage of Kelly's case, as the fifth and most extensively documented of the murders, occupied substantial space in the national and London press throughout November and into December of 1888. The combination of the unresolved investigation, the dramatic circumstances of the discovery, and the sustained press interest produced a public narrative around the Whitechapel murders that had no clear precedent in British criminal history. The case of Mary Jane Kelly passed into cultural record in the decades that followed, as part of the broader phenomenon that came to surround the Whitechapel murders as a whole. From the 1880s onward, the killings attracted dramatisations, popular accounts, and an expanding body of investigative literature. Alfred Hitchcock's 1927 film The Lodger drew on the Ripper myth without directly dramatising the murders. The case generated a sustained field of study, known in later decades as Ripperology, which produced a substantial body of print literature proposing analysing and disputing the identities of more than 100 named suspects. Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's graphic novel From Hell, serialised between 1989 and 1998 and collected in book form in 1999, placed Kelly at the centre of an extended narrative treatment of the murders and their social context, drawing on one of the conspiracy theories that had attached itself to the case while explicitly noting in the work's appendix the limits of that theory as historical argument. A film adaptation followed in 2001. In 2019, Hallie Rubenhold published The Five, a work of historical non-fiction that examined the lives of all 5 canonical Whitechapel victims, including Kelly, with deliberate attention to the documentary record of each woman's life, rather than to the question of the killer's identity. The work was awarded the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction in 2019 and represented the most sustained published effort to reconstruct Kelly's life as a subject of historical inquiry in its own right. The historical significance of the case extends across several distinct areas of the record. The murder at Miller's Court was the only one of the 5 canonical Whitechapel killings to have been committed indoors, a circumstance that afforded the investigating officers a substantially more detailed scene than the street killings had provided, and that also afforded the perpetrator a substantially greater period of unobserved activity. The post-mortem reports produced by Phillips and Bond were preserved in the Metropolitan Police Archive and have been the subject of detailed forensic and historical analysis in the century and more since they were written. Bond's written assessment of the probable characteristics of the killer is regularly cited in the history of forensic investigation as an early documented instance of the systematic profiling of an unknown perpetrator from crime scene evidence, a method that would not be formalised as an investigative tool until the latter decades of the 20th century. The inquest's unusual speed, its jurisdictional peculiarity, and the sharp exchange between Coroner MacDonald and the juror who sought to call additional witnesses have remained subjects of discussion in the subsequent literature. The question of whether the proceedings were deliberately curtailed and by whose direction has not been answered by the documentary record. What the record contains is the transcript of a single day's proceedings, a verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown, and the formal closure of the coroner's inquiry. Dorset Street itself did not survive the 20th century in its Victorian form. In a programme of slum clearance that proceeded in the early decades of the century, the buildings of Dorset Street were demolished. The street was renamed Duval Street. The passage to Miller's Court was removed. The site where Room 13 once stood is now occupied by a multi-storey car park that serves the market at Spitalfields. The covered passage through which Thomas Bowyer walked on the morning of the 9th of November, 1888, does not exist. The room in which Mary Ann Cox heard singing through the wall on the last night of Kelly's life does not exist. What remains is the documentary record, the inquest testimony, the Metropolitan Police files, the press coverage, the post-mortem reports, and the grave registration at St Patrick's Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone, which places the burial at number 16, row 67, in the northeastern corner of the grounds. The gravestone, if one was erected, has not been located. The exact position of the grave cannot now be reliably identified within the cemetery. The registration is what the archive holds. The case of Mary Jane Kelly closes the record of this examination. No arrest was ever made. The inquest returned its verdict. The case passed into culture. The record continues to be examined. The Metropolitan Police canvassing effort that followed the discovery on the 9th of November was extensive in its scope. Officers from H Division were deployed through the streets immediately surrounding Miller's Court, and the inquiry extended outward into the broader district of Spitalfields and into adjacent streets in Whitechapel and Stepney. Every common lodging house in the vicinity was visited. Keepers of lodging houses were asked whether any of their residents had returned in unusual circumstances or at unusual hours on the morning of the 9th. Individual lodgers were questioned. Street sellers who worked the early morning hours were sought out and their observations recorded. Costermongers whose pitches were in the streets adjacent to Dorset Street were interviewed. Cab drivers who had been working the East End on the night of the 8th and the morning of the 9th were identified and their routes and fares examined. The effort was systematic in its methodology and broad in its reach, and it produced a substantial volume of recorded statement material that was entered into the Metropolitan Police files alongside the earlier material gathered in connection with the August, September and October murders. None of that material, taken individually or in combination, produced a workable identification of the perpetrator. The geographic focus of the canvassing was informed in part by the description George Hutchinson had provided at Commercial Street Police Station on the 12th of November. The description, once accepted by Inspector Aberline as meriting circulation, was used to direct officers toward the better lit and more frequented streets of the area, where a man of the appearance Hutchinson described, well-dressed and of relatively prosperous aspect, might have been noted by cab drivers, street sellers, or the keepers of establishments open in the late evening and early morning hours. The assumption embedded in this approach that Hutchinson's account was accurate and that the man he described had been present in the area was itself contested by the absence of any corroborating sighting. No other witness came forward to describe a man of that appearance in the vicinity of Miller's Court or Dorset Street in the hours Hutchinson specified. The absence of corroboration did not by itself disprove the account, given the conditions of visibility and the hour, but it was noted in the investigative record and has been examined in the subsequent literature. The name under which Kelly was known varied across the accounts collected by the police and published in the press. She was referred to in different documents as Mary Jane Kelly, Mary Kelly, and Marie Jeanette Kelly. The French form of her name, Marie Jeanette, appeared in certain press accounts and was the form used on the coffin plate at her burial. The origin of this name is not documented in any source that has been located. Barnett's inquest testimony does not specifically address why she used the French form or when she had adopted it. One inference that has been drawn in later accounts connects the French form of the name to the period Kelly spent working in the West End establishment in Fitzrovia, where a French affectation might have been adopted or encouraged as part of the manner of that employment. This inference is not supported by any direct evidence. The name Kelly used for herself in her daily life was, by all witness testimony from Miller's Court and the surrounding neighbourhood, Mary Jane Kelly, or simply Mary. The French form appears principally in the written record rather than in the oral testimony of those who had known her. The press coverage of the murder in the days following the 9th of November reflected the sustained public attention that had been building since the August killings. The Times published detailed accounts of the discovery, of the inquest proceedings, and of the funeral cortege and burial. The Daily Telegraph and the Star maintained similar coverage. The Illustrated Police News, which had published illustrated representations of the scenes and victims of the earlier murders, produced further illustrations in connection with the Kelly case, including a sketch of the exterior of Miller's Court and of the covered passage through which access to the court was reached. These illustrated supplements circulated widely within the literate working-class readership that constituted the primary market for the penny and halfpenny press. The Whitechapel murders had generated what the press itself described as a sustained state of public alarm, and the Kelly murder, as the fifth killing and the most severe in terms of the evidence available at the scene, intensified that alarm rather than exhausting it. Editorial commentary in multiple publications questioned the adequacy of the Metropolitan Police's response to the series of murders and the competence of those directing the investigation. The Home Secretary was pressed repeatedly in the press, in Parliament, and in correspondence from public bodies and private individuals to take direct action in relation to the inquiry. The lodging houses of Dorset Street occupied a specific place in the geography of the East End that requires some elaboration. The common lodging house of the 1880s was a registered establishment, subject in theory to inspection and regulation under the Common Lodging Houses Acts of 1851 and 1853, which required that such premises be registered with the Metropolitan Board of Works and inspected by officers of the Metropolitan Police. In practice, the inspection regime, as applied to the lodging houses of Dorset Street and the surrounding streets, was intermittent, and conditions varied considerably between establishments. The lodging houses of Dorset Street were operated principally by two landlords, John McCarthy and William Crossingham, whose holdings between them accounted for the majority of the accommodation on the street. An estimated 1,200 men slept nightly in the lodging houses of Dorset Street alone. The street's population was transient in character, with occupants moving between establishments as their financial circumstances allowed or required. The police were said, by contemporary observers, to patrol Dorset Street only in pairs, and some accounts state that individual officers did not enter the street alone after dark. The street's reputation in this period was derived not from any single incident, but from the accumulated record of the violence, theft, and disorder that the lodging house economy of the 1880s had concentrated within it. Room 13 in Miller's Court stood at a remove from the street itself, accessed through the covered passage, and therefore occupied a position of relative isolation within an already isolated world. The passage afforded no view from Dorset Street once a person had entered it, and the court at its far end was not directly overlooked by the street. The rooms in the court were arranged around a small yard. Sound passed between rooms through the walls, as the testimony of Mary Ann Cox and Elizabeth Prater demonstrates. Cox heard Kelly singing through the shared wall that night, and Prater heard the cry from the room below her. But what happened within a room could not be observed from outside it. The broken window pane, patched with rags, was the only aperture through which the interior of room 13 was accessible to observation from the court, and it was through that aperture that Thomas Bowyer, on the morning of the 9th of November, first saw what was on the bed. The song Mary Ann Cox heard Kelly singing through the wall that night was a particular choice of music hall repertoire. A Violet from Mother's Grave, written by Will H. Fox and published in 1881, was a widely known and frequently performed ballad that appeared in the programmes of music halls throughout London and the provinces during the 1880s. Its lyrics are set in the voice of a child who tends the grave of a deceased mother and takes a violet from the grave as a keepsake of the life that preceded loss. The song circulated in printed sheet music form, and the Library of Congress holds a copy of the original edition. It was a sentimental composition of the kind that formed a standard part of the music hall canon of the period, available to anyone who frequented the halls, or who had heard it sung in the street, or in a lodging house. Whether Kelly had encountered it in Wales or in Cardiff, or during her years in London, the record does not say. What the record preserves is that she sang it repeatedly through the wall of room 13 on the night of the 8th of November, 1888, while Mary Ann Cox sat in the adjoining space and listened, and that by 1 o'clock in the morning the singing had stopped. The question of the coroner's jurisdiction over the Kelly inquest has been examined in the subsequent literature with some persistence. Wynne Edwin Baxter, who served as coroner for East Middlesex, had presided over the inquests into the deaths of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, the 4 preceding canonical victims. Each of those inquests had been held in halls and venues within the East End, consistent with the geographic jurisdiction that Baxter administered. Kelly's body was removed to the mortuary at Shoreditch, a decision taken on the morning of the 9th of November by the attending officers. That removal placed the body within the jurisdictional boundary of North East Middlesex, where Dr. Roderick MacDonald served as coroner. Whether the removal to Shoreditch rather than to a mortuary within Whitechapel was the result of a deliberate calculation by the police or the Home Office, a routine operational decision made without broader intent, or some combination of circumstance and administrative habit has not been established by any document that has been identified in the archive. MacDonald's conduct of the inquest, particularly his brevity and his sharp refusal to allow the jury to determine the scope of the evidence, contrasted with Baxter's more extended proceedings in the earlier cases and attracted comment in the press at the time. That contrast has continued to be remarked upon by those who have examined the record. The testimony Joseph Barnett gave at the inquest on the 12th of November is the primary vehicle through which Kelly's life before London entered the historical record, and the limitations of that testimony deserve their own examination. Barnett had known Kelly since the 8th of April 1887, a period of approximately 19 months at the time of the inquest. He had lived with her through that period in a succession of addresses, and the two had settled at Miller's Court by March of 1888. His knowledge of her early life was therefore derived entirely from what she had chosen to tell him during those 19 months, in the ordinary course of a shared domestic life. He was not a record keeper. He was a fish porter at Billingsgate Market, a man of modest means and limited formal education, and his testimony at the inquest was the testimony of a man who had listened to a woman he loved describe her past, and who was now reporting what he remembered of those accounts to a coroner's court 3 days after identifying her body from her ears and her eyes. Barnett's testimony was given under oath and was received by the court without challenge to its substance. Coroner MacDonald did not press Barnett extensively on the details of Kelly's early life. The inquest was not principally concerned with establishing Kelly's biography, but with establishing the cause of death and the circumstances immediately surrounding it. The biographical material Barnett provided was entered into the record, and in the absence of any contradicting evidence, it has remained the foundation of everything that is known of Kelly's life before 1887. No researcher examining the case in the period since has been able to locate a birth record for Kelly in Limerick, a marriage record for a Kelly and a Davies in a Welsh county, or a record of a colliery fatality matching the account Barnett described. The absence of documentation does not mean the events did not occur. Record survival in Limerick and in the Welsh coalfields in the 1860s and 1870s was incomplete, and the relevant registers have not all been examined. What it means is that the record is as Barnett left it, a story told by one person to another, entered into an inquest transcript and preserved in that form. The fire in the grate at room 13 continued to occupy investigators, and in later years, researchers examining the Metropolitan Police files. The physical evidence of the fire was documented at the scene. The tin kettle with its spout melted, the remnants of burned clothing identified among the ash, the intensity of the heat required to produce those effects from a standard domestic grate. Dr. Phillips, attending the scene on the morning of the 9th, noted the fire as part of his observations. The question of what the fire was for and who had lit or fed it was not resolved by the physical evidence alone. The interpretation that the fire had been stoked high to provide light for activities conducted in the room is consistent with the documented condition of the grate, and with the absence of any candle or lamp burning when Bowyer looked through the window the following morning. The interpretation that clothing or other material was burned in the fire to eliminate evidence is consistent with the presence of burned fabric among the remains in the grate, and with the quantity of heat required to produce the effects observed. The two interpretations are not mutually exclusive. The record holds the evidence and the competing interpretations without resolving the question. The Metropolitan Police files relating to the Whitechapel murders were held within the Metropolitan Police's own archive for many decades following the close of the active investigation. They were not accessible to the public or to independent researchers during that period. In 1976, a significant portion of the files was opened to public inspection at the Public Record Office, which has since become the National Archives at Kew. The files designated within the MEPO series include the statements of witnesses, the correspondence received by the police in connection with the inquiry, the reports of senior officers, and the post-mortem documents produced by Phillips and Bond. The opening of those files to public research produced a substantial increase in the body of detailed analysis that could be brought to bear on the Whitechapel murders generally, and on the Kelly case specifically. Researchers who had previously been dependent on press coverage, inquest transcripts reproduced in Victorian and Edwardian publications, and the recollections of individuals connected to the inquiry were now able to read the documents that had been held within the police archive for the better part of a century. The post-mortem reports of Phillips and Bond, the Hutchinson statement, the canvassing records and the broader correspondence of the inquiry became available in their original form. What those documents revealed was, in many respects, consistent with what had already been established from the inquest transcripts and the contemporary press. What they added was the specificity of the investigative record itself, the language of the officers writing to their superiors, the systematic enumeration of avenues pursued and eliminated, the weight of an inquiry that had generated an enormous quantity of paper without producing a result. The investigation formally continued into 1889, though at a reduced level of active effort. The Whitechapel murders inquiry was not declared closed, but the resources directed to it diminished as the months passed without a further killing that could be connected to the series. Inspector Aberline's active direction of the inquiry was progressively reduced as other demands on H Division's personnel required attention. By 1889 and into the early 1890s, the Whitechapel murders investigation had become a file that remained open in the administrative sense without receiving the day-to-day direction it had commanded in the autumn of 1888. Officers continued to forward to the file material that seemed relevant as it came to their attention, and the correspondence continued to accumulate. The question of the killer's identity was never answered. The position of Joseph Barnett in the years after Kelly's death is documented only partially in the public record. He appeared at the inquest on the 12th of November and gave the testimony that has been preserved in the transcript. He was present at Kelly's funeral on the 19th of November and is described in the account of that occasion as one of the principal mourners travelling in the mourning carriages. Beyond those documented appearances, in the days immediately following Kelly's death, the record of Barnett's subsequent life is thin. He had been employed as a fish porter at Billingsgate Market and is believed to have continued in similar employment in the years that followed. His name appears in later ripperological literature, primarily in connection with the proposition advanced by some researchers in the latter decades of the 20th century that Barnett himself may have been responsible for Kelly's death. That proposition is a product of the post-archive opening period of research and was not a contemporaneous suspicion held by the Metropolitan Police. The police interviewed Barnett at length at the time. He was not charged. The contemporaneous record does not present him as a suspect. The suggestion that he may have been responsible belongs to the retrospective literature, not to the investigative record of 1888. The case of Mary Jane Kelly closes the record examined here. One life, one investigation, one verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown, entered at Shoreditch Town Hall on the 12th of November 1888, and never superseded by anything that followed. The case passed into literature, into film, into a century and more of sustained examination. The record remained. The questions remained.